The image was, at first glance, the very apotheosis of imperial splendor and ancient tradition. On May 6, 2023, King Charles III processed down the nave of Westminster Abbey, resplendent in the velvet and ermine of the robe of state, the weight of the St. Edward's crown upon his head, the sovereign's scepter and rod in his hands. The world saw a millennia-old rite of passage fulfilled. The boy who had waited a lifetime was finally king. Yet, within the heart of that ornate spectacle, in a fleeting, unguarded moment captured not by the official broadcast, but by the perceptive lens of a single photographer, lay a truth far more potent and revealing than any ceremonial symbol. It was a moment of profound, heart-beating solitude. A king, alone in a crowded abbey, caught in a private vortex of grief, duty, and unresolved history. This was the moment that, more than any grand fanfare or loyal acclamation, shook the foundations of the royal family, exposing not just the personal cost to one man, but the deep structural and emotional fissures challenging the very institution he now embodies. The moment occurred after the crowning, during the solemn homage, as the archbishops, princes, and peers knelt to pledge their allegiance. A camera angle from the choir stalls framed Charles in profile. The public exuberance was gone. His face, turned momentarily away from the congregation toward the high altar, was a tableau of overwhelming emotion. His eyes, glistening, seemed to look not at the gold plate before him, but through it, into a vast internal distance. His lips, pressed tightly together, trembled with the Herculean effort of containment. In his stillness, there was a universe of weariness. This was not the mask of regal solemnity. This was the raw, unedited face of a 74-year-old man bearing a crushing triple weight: the suffocating grief for his late mother, the daunting immensity of the duty now irrevocably his, and the haunting, lifelong shadow of his own fractured family history, replaying in the echoing silence of the abbey's sanctity. To understand the depth of the grief in that glance is to grasp the unique 73-year symbiosis between Charles and his mother, Queen Elizabeth II. His was not a loss of a parent in the ordinary twilight of life. It was the tectonic shift of a planetary constant. Elizabeth was not just his mother. She was his sovereign, his employer, the architect of his public role, and the immutable backdrop against which his entire identity as prince, heir, and now king was formed. Their relationship, complex and often strained under the pressures of duty and public expectation, was nevertheless the most defining of his life. As her coffin lay in state in Westminster Hall, Charles had been the picture of stoic dignity. Yet insiders spoke of a man utterly bereft and private, grappling with a loss that was both profoundly intimate and staggeringly constitutional. The coronation, meant to be his ascension, was inescapably also her final, formal eclipse. Every element of the ritual underscored her absence. The St. Edward's crown placed on his head was the same one that had rested on her brow 70 years prior. The oath he swore was the one she had fulfilled with such devotion. The Abbey itself was the site of her wedding and coronation, now a vessel brimming with her memory. In that charged moment of solitude, the celebration of a new reign collided violently with the mourning for the old. The heartbreak was, in part, the realization that the stabilizing, maternal anchor of his existence and of the monarchy itself was gone. He was now the lonely figure at the apex, the one to whom the nation would look for the continuity she personified, yet without her guiding presence. The mantle he now wore felt less like silk and more like a vast, inherited solitude. But the ghosts in the Abbey that day were not only of the departed. The most palpable and politically charged absence was that of Prince Harry, the Duke of Sussex, and his wife, Meghan. Harry's brief, solitary appearance, sitting in the third row, darting out of the Abbey immediately after the service to catch a flight back to California, was a wound disguised as a formality. The chasm documented in Harry's memoir Spare and the Netflix series was not healed. It was merely on global display. the image of the king surrounded by the trappings of sacred union, while his younger son, the spare turned stranger, sat as a distant spectator, underscored a devastating familial rupture. This was the second layer of the heartbreaking moment, the confrontation with a failed paternal narrative. Charles, who had suffered so publicly from his own parents' emotional distance and the collapse of his first marriage, had once aspired to be a more modern, emotionally available father. The Harry and Meghan saga represented a catastrophic failure of that aspiration, playing out not in private counseling sessions, but in global headlines and primetime television specials. The coronation, a ritual meant to symbolize national unity, instead highlighted an irreconcilable family schism. The king's sorrow was likely laced with a potent mix of personal hurt, public humiliation, and the bitter irony that his own crowning was marred by the very dynastic discord he had sought to avoid. Furthermore, the absence extended to Prince Andrew, the disgraced Duke of York. His presence, though subdued and in mere mourning clothes rather than ceremonial robes, was a stark reminder of another crisis of trust and judgment that had battered the family's reputation. Charles, as king and as the de facto head of the family firm, now bears sole responsibility for managing these corrosive scandals. The moment of solitude was therefore a glimpse of a man burdened. Beneath the grief and the family strife lay the third weight, the colossal burden of a purpose delayed and now perhaps circumscribed. Charles is the oldest monarch ever to ascend the British throne. He spent 7 decades as the Prince of Wales, a role he molded into one of the most proactive, advocacy-driven airships in history. He was a meddling prince, passionate about architecture, the environment, organic farming, and interfaith dialogue. He built institutions, wrote passionate memos, the infamous Black Spider memos, and championed causes with often controversial zeal. The crown, however, demands neutrality. The sovereign must be seen to be believed, but not to have overt opinions. The heartbreaking moment captured the profound existential pivot this requires. The fiery advocate had to be sublimated into the impartial icon. The man who had spent a lifetime doing now must spend his remaining years primarily being. For a figure of such intense intellectual energy and strong conviction, this is not merely a change of job title. It is a quiet annihilation of a core aspect of his identity. The glistening eyes may have held, alongside grief, a flicker of mourning for the purposeful prince he was required to leave behind in the cloisters of history. This single, unscripted moment resonated so deeply because it functioned as a rare crack in the monarchical edifice, revealing the vulnerable humanity at its center. In an institution built on the careful curation of image, where emotion is protocol-bound and personal pain is a private matter, this was a devastatingly public leak of truth. It shook the royal family in several profound ways. It humanized the symbol. For decades, a monarchy's strategy has been to allow controlled glimpses of humanity, the walkabouts, the televised documentary, to foster connection. This moment was uncontrolled. It showed not a king graciously connecting with subjects, but a man buckling, however briefly, under an almost inhuman pressure. This vulnerability, while evoking sympathy, also destabilizes the myth of the sovereign as a figure of unimpeachable superhuman fortitude, a cornerstone of the mystique.